Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. We've brought out Monitor Steve for a little bit of a discussion video post some of the Computex announcements that have happened throughout the past couple of days. We've had press events from Intel, AMD and Nvidia where we saw stuff like, well, the 3080 Ti and the 3070 Ti announcements from Nvidia. On the AMD side, we got FidelityFX Super Resolution or FSR, new APUs for the desktop, 6000 mGPUs for mobile products, and then a bit of cache-related stuff for upcoming Zen processors. And then, well, let's just not talk about the Intel side of things because they didn't really announce anything worth talking about. So I covered most of the news stuff from this week, so I'm super interested. Just first up, Steve, what were your thoughts? What was the most exciting thing that you saw from the Computex announcements?
Well, I think we have to sort of hand it to AMD on that one. Obviously, FSR, big surprise there. We knew that technology was coming at some point. I didn't think it would be so early. Of course, there's still a lot to be seen yet, but just that announcement was very impressive. And of course, showing it running on a GTX 1060, they kind of took the cake with that one. So that was very cool. Obviously, their stackable cache technology, which we're going to see, we believe, in Zen 3 Plus, I think it'll be later this year. That's also very cool. But I think for now, at least, FSR, because that's been something, they've been lacking the DLSS competitor. We've talked about it time and time again. That's something they really needed to get the ball rolling with. And we discussed it might have been a Q&A, the Scott Herkelman interview with PC World, right. I think it was. Yep. And it didn't sound very positive at the time. They were sort of saying that they were trying a few different solutions and they were hoping, or they were planning to have it towards the end of the year. And it sort of sounded like a typical kind of AMD release. But yeah, they obviously were very careful about it. They didn't overpromise, and they've come out of nowhere with it, really. Yeah,
I think that's very, very fair at this point. It's one of those situations where I was sitting there in the pre-briefing and sort of, this is being talked about at this point. I was sort of expecting it more towards the later end of the year, maybe like Q4 or something like that, just based on those statements. But no, I guess they're ready to talk about it now and launch it, and hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll have quality comparisons, performance comparisons for you guys in a detailed video. But one thing I did want to get to in this video was sort of just talking about our expectations for what we think is going to happen when FSR comes out onto the market. Where is it going to stack up versus DLSS? So I'm interested to hear your thoughts first on, what do you expect to see from FSR? How's it going to stack up? Do you expect it to be good? Do you expect it to be bad? Where do you sort of lie based on what you've seen so far?
You think about it logically, applying a logic to AMD. And to be fair, like AMD, this isn't answering your question directly, but they've had sort of messy releases over the years. Things haven't gone as well as expected. And it's kind of like, AMD's promising, especially the Radeon group, they're promising performance or whatever, and it doesn't really pan out that well. And I think I don't know if it's a management thing, they're getting their sort of, they're getting things better worked out, or maybe it's a combination of things, like they've now got the financial backing as well, so it's all coming together for them. Not sure what it is, but I'm a little bit more confident in saying that I'm expecting it to be quite good. Now, I'm not saying I expect it to be DLSS good or better. I wouldn't set the bar quite that high, but I'm expecting it to be certainly better than DLSS 1.0. The original implementation of DLSS that we saw in Battlefield 5, which was laughably bad in my opinion. If they're coming out with that, surely they know better. So you would hope that they've taken note, they've seen how DLSS has progressed, and they're not going to start at DLSS 1.0, because that would be a bit of a disaster, a wrong first step, let's say.
It'd be pretty embarrassing for them. And I think what we've seen, even just from these initial quality comparisons, is that they're a step ahead of that already. Like, even just looking at some of their 4K quality stuff. One of the things I pointed out a lot in those DLSS videos, for 1.0 at least, was the DLSS didn't just make the image blurry, but in many situations, it kind of changed the image with
misinformation.
Sort of this oil painting type effect that we sometimes see from smartphone photos when they apply denoising. So it kind of, it didn't just make it blurry, it made it look different. And I think what we're seeing on the AMD side with FSR from their early samples is that they're not really having that same sort of issue. But certainly from my expectations, again, I think if you're expecting it to be DLSS 2.0 quality straight off the bat, you're going to be in for a bit of a disappointment, because that's quite a high bar to reach. Nvidia's this is their third iteration of the technology. They've gone from DLSS 1.0 to sort of that control intermediary to DLSS 2.0, and this is AMD's first attempt at it. So being able to match what Nvidia's done over the past 18 months with DLSS 2.0 and then everything they learnt before that with their earlier editions, I mean, come on, you're asking a lot there. But certainly I would expect image quality to fall somewhere between the 1.0 and 2.0 versions. It's just a matter of, where in that range is it going to fall?
Yeah, exactly. I would say that it would have to be somewhere towards the middle at least of DLSS 1.0 and 2.0 in terms of quality. And while it may be that is obviously worse quality than what we currently get from DLSS, I think that would be a huge success. And you asked me about what my expectation is, but I think it's also important to set everybody's expectations correctly. And by that, I mean sort of the critical analysis of FSR, you would tackle that quite differently, in my opinion, to DLSS in some ways. And by that, I mean, you, for example, were very critical of DLSS, the initial implementation, because, well, it was garbage. But even if it was quite a bit better, you still would have been fairly critical because they made some bold claims. And let's not forget they were using DLSS to sell the Turing-based GPUs. So those Turing-based GPUs, if you were a Pascal owner, GTX 1080 Ti in particular, if you had one of those GPUs, Turing didn't really offer you anything in terms of rasterization performance. There was no improvement there in cost per frame. So Nvidia were really leveraging heavily these RTX features, so ray tracing, DLSS. So DLSS was being sold to you as a feature. So whereas with FSR, it's coming after the release of the 6000 series. You didn't really buy, if you could, a 6800 XT or a 1600 XT or whatever it may be, because of the promises that FSR was going to boost performance by X amount and it was going to improve image quality beyond native. There was none of those claims made. So the approach to analyzing it and critiquing it is you've got different expectations there. So I think that's important to keep in mind before we even look at it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we saw back at I think it was like the 6800 XT launch or the announcement, FSR was only included on like the corner of one slide. And I think I had to ask AMD what that even meant. I don't think they talked about it in any extensive detail in their presentation. So I agree, there is quite a substantial difference in the way that they're marketing it. And yeah, the quality differences, while I expect they will be there, and I would expect maybe FSR to be better at, say, higher resolutions and probably fall away at lower resolutions. At least some of the early demonstrations that we're seeing seem to be suggesting that. We'll have to wait and see more, to figure out exactly where it lies. But at the end of the day, the quality is just one aspect of the whole situation. It seems to be one that a lot of people are focusing on, but there are other things that AMD is bringing to the table, like the performance advantages, but more crucially, the wide support for a whole range of GPUs. So it's going to be a very interesting balancing act to see, when you measure up not just the quality and performance, but also how many GPUs is this supported on, what's the sort of game support looking like, which obviously we don't expect to be, as widely supported as DLSS 2.0 right away. That would be quite a surprise. So when you sort of measure up all those things, there's certainly a lot of reasons why AMD can still succeed with an FSR type technology, even if the visual quality of the technology isn't quite up to the level of DLSS 2.0 to begin with.
Yeah, it has to be decent out of the gate, and really that'll set it up for success, because as you say, they've been afforded a little leeway in terms of image quality because of how broadly supported the technology claims to be. I mean, they've already shown it working on a GTX 1060, so that's quite incredible, really. And it's going to make it difficult to push DLSS moving forward with developers if you've got an FSR type solution that works on GeForce and Radeon GPUs, and not just the latest ones, but going back a few generations. So that's a really big deal.
Yeah, and on top of that, we're hearing that FSR is an easier technology to implement. At least AMD is claiming that. A few developers seem to be leaking this sort of information that FSR is an easier tech to implement. And certainly when it's open source, that generally will mean that it's easier to implement from developers. DLSS is quite famously a black box technology where effectively you just get a package. You don't get to see necessarily how DLSS works, and then the developers have to apply the inputs to that technology, get out the results. And the fact that FSR is only a spatial technology instead of a temporal technology, so it doesn't require things like motion vectors or previous frames to work, will also assist in making it easier for developers to implement. So it'll be very interesting to see how that sort of game support goes over time, whether the advantages for implementation actually helps AMD in this situation, because certainly not including temporal data and motion vectors may hurt their image quality. So it's one of those, again, another balancing act where AMD seems to be going for the broad, widespread approach. Let's get this working on as many things as possible, whereas Nvidia has taken the narrower approach, but potentially the better quality at the end of the day.
I think for it to succeed, it requires most of the things it has, and then, as I said, just get that image quality to a satisfactory level where you're not, to get that quite significant performance boost, you're not really noticing the downgrade in visual quality. I think for most gamers, that's all they require. And I suppose covering this subject is quite difficult because a technology like DLSS is applied in different ways depending on the gamer, like the games they're playing, the resolutions they're targeting, the frame rates they're targeting, what they're trying to achieve. Like, is image quality even important, or are you just trying to boost the performance of a slower card to get to satisfactory frame rates? Or are you there's so many different ways this technology can be used. So what may be a bit of a fail for you or not particularly appealing may be great for another gamer. And I guess just getting it in a really wide range of games will be one of the key points of this technology.
I think that's where DLSS 1.0 failed, was that it was worse than technologies that we already had to use for things like improving performance. I think in my initial video covering Battlefield 5, for example, we clearly showed that it was worse than just running the game at a lower resolution, which you can just do right now on all GPUs. So I don't expect that AMD would make the mistake, and we've already talked about this, about how they would release a technology that is just as good as what we've already got. There would be no point releasing that technology. It would have to be better, and if it's better than any sort of upscaling, sharpening technology that we've already got, then that would be a success, especially for those GPUs that don't support DLSS. And for games that don't support DLSS, having any sort of better than what we've already got technology is a success in some degree. And of course, being a first iteration of the technology, who knows where it could go in terms of quality down the line. Whereas with something like DLSS, because they're already achieving close to native in a lot of situations, close to native image quality that is, there's fewer ways that Nvidia could accelerate that technology and make it better than what it already is now, apart from things like game support. One of the other interesting points I think may come up with FSR is how AMD may use this technology to their advantage for future GPU architectures. At the moment, AMD doesn't have something like tensor cores. They do have acceleration built in for lower level data types into RDNA2, but they don't necessarily have those dedicated processing cores that Nvidia does. So it'll be interesting to learn more about how FSR works and whether it could potentially be accelerated to a greater extent in a future architecture. Because I think AMD's play here, and I was recently watching a video from Moore's Law is Dead, which I think made a really good point about this, which is that if you can achieve broad adoption with a technology like this right now, then you can start optimizing it in your architectures down the track, and having a head start and being able to design the technology yourself can have big implications for future architectures. Do you think we'll see potentially something like that happening if this ends up being a success?
Oh, I think absolutely. Whether we'll see that with like RDNA 3, hard to say. I wouldn't be terribly surprised. Of course, we've got to see how it all plays out. We haven't even tested it properly yet, but that definitely seems like a path they could be taking. Though I don't know how much of an advantage. Obviously, it gives them some advantage, but I don't know how much of an advantage it would ultimately give them over Nvidia, because it is an open source technology essentially.
Right.
So Nvidia could also optimize architectures for it, and it would just become sort of this universally used feature. Although it's AMD FSR, it would just be sort of just generically, I suppose, referenced as FSR and not so much attached to AMD anymore. It just becomes this feature that games support, and we've seen that with a lot of other technologies, rendering technologies in the past, that sort of started with one company and then just became a universally supported and accepted feature.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's kind of the play that we've seen with all sorts of open technologies. You know, you can go to things like HBAO, which sort of started off as an Nvidia thing, and now it's widely used in a range of games. obviously there's been that competition between features like Hairworks and TressFX, which eventually nowadays hair technology is kind of ubiquitous. Apart from a few games, you don't really see either of those labels being used. And right from the start, talking about these sort of upscaling technologies, we have talked about the future of these sorts of things is just the switch in games that you turn on that says resolution upscaling. It's not going to be a DLSS or FSR thing. And it requires this sort of competition between AMD and Nvidia, FSR and DLSS for that sort of thing to happen. And it's not going to happen this year. It's not going to happen next year. But down the track in 5 years or so, we're probably not going to be sitting here talking about FSR versus DLSS. It's going to be widely used. Game engines may have different uses and different implementations of these sorts of technologies, and you'll just be able to choose whether you enable it or not on all GPUs. But obviously, in the meantime, it's going to be more about, the game support, which we've talked about a little bit in the past. How many games does DLSS support? How many games does FSR support? And all the things like image quality. So I think that's probably enough discussion on FSR, given we're sort of, I guess, just speculating and providing our expectations on that technology. We still have to actually get it in our hands, test it, which we can expect to happen in the next couple of weeks ahead of the launch. But for now, I wanted to change tunes a little bit and talk about the other major thing that's happened this week, which is, of course, the launch of Nvidia's GeForce RTX 3080 Ti, which you reviewed on the channel yesterday. It's not a very good product, is it? It's not an exciting, get out of bed, let's buy GPU sort of thing. It's quite a disappointing release.
It's very much a disappointing release. Obviously it's not a bad product. It's actually, depending how you look at it, it's an exceptionally good product. It's, the 2 gig of extra VRAM. It's not nothing. That's kind of a neat little feature over the 3080. Obviously the performance is, exceptionally good. It's an extremely high performance graphics card. But what lets it down is, the price. Obviously, pricing right now is a disaster anyway, but that's kind of besides the point. And, availability is a mess as well. So it's obviously $1,200 US is the MSRP. It's 71% more expensive than the 3080 for like 10% performance on average extra. So well into the point of diminishing returns there. Obviously doesn't make sense. So just not a good product from that standpoint. But then people will argue, well, they're going to be $2,000 anyway, so it doesn't matter. Kind of a valid point, I suppose. But getting away from that, our main issue with the whole release and why we thought it was poorly timed and, being a bit tone deaf was the fact that rather than see these refreshes where Nvidia takes the opportunity to make even more money, which you can argue, they're a company and that's what they're designed to do, all this talk about wanting to help gamers and be for gamers and all that kind of stuff. It would have been great to see like an RTX 3050 Ti, maybe something like that. $200 product with a $250 product that they can, get more dies out from the same wafer or single wafer. That would have been pretty cool. That would have been an exciting release for Computex. And if we had have seen more of those GPUs, that would have certainly helped ease the supply issues moving forward. Whereas the 3080 Ti doesn't help at all. If anything, it just means going forward, the 3080 is going to be more difficult to find because Nvidia is just cashing in. So, technically not a bad product, just poorly timed and not a good price. And so I saw some people arguing that, we focused, while I did compare it to the 3090 and the 3080, we sort of focused on how bad value it is relative to the 3080. And a few people argued that we really should have been compared to the 3090 relative to the 3090. It is quite good value, which is a stretch, but okay. But if you're going to compare it to the 3090, I'd argue, what is the point of a 3080 Ti? Like, why release it at all? It's within 80% of the cost of a 3090, but half the VRAM. And it's like you're kind of buying this gimped flagship product. Like, why not just spend the extra $300 US if they're available at MSRP, of course, for the 3090. Yeah, and also when talking about Founders Edition cards, you get this 2.2 kilo monster card, whereas the 3080 Ti is just, it's a little 3080. It's just a 2-slot card for a ridiculous amount of money. Nvidia must be laughing, really, because they copped a lot of flack for the 2080 Ti, and us along with everybody else basically called that a terrible value product. Yeah, it's the fastest graphics card available, but at what was it meant to be $1,000 US, and it really ended up being $1,200 US, funnily enough. And they couldn't really do that again. They couldn't afford to cop the flack again for a poor value product, especially with AMD becoming more competitive. So they offered the 3080 for $700 US, which is just a fantastic deal in our opinion. We gave it a very positive review. We thought the 3080 at $700 was just amazing. But they obviously don't want to charge only $700 US. And now, because of the way things have panned out, they've actually got to make the $1,200 2080 Ti again as the 3080 Ti. So kind of funny how that's worked out for them.
Yeah, it makes no sense if you're a high-end buyer, you're the deep pockets, rich gamer. Whenever you're buying the best of the best, you just buy the best of the best. If you've got lots of money, you buy the 3090. The 3080 doesn't serve many markets. It's sort of the same as a 6900 XT, where that card really needed to also be the best of the best. If you've got a ridiculous amount of money to spend, you're not concerned about cost per frame. Obviously, in that instance, you'd buy a 6800 XT. Then, yeah, you just buy the 3090 again for that GPU. So, yeah, even in a normal market, it makes slightly more sense, but not a ton of sense anyway. And I guess, were you surprised that it was a $1,200 GPU?
Well,
were you expecting it to be cheaper?
Well, as I say, in a normal market, it makes no sense, less sense. In this market, it makes some sense because they can sell it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
In a normal market, you'd be absolutely mad to buy this because, as I said, $300 more gets you the full thing. It gets you the 24 gig of RAM. So, VRAM, why not do that? But did I think it was going to be? Was the question? Did I think it was going to be $1,200? Well, slightly funny story about that. I didn't film rather. I scripted my entire video because obviously reviewers didn't get the price until the Computex announcement. So I've had this card in hand for over a week, and we got the driver almost a week in advance, I think it ended up being. So, that was great from Nvidia. Had plenty of time to test the card properly, and we included some ray tracing benchmarks because of that. But I guessed it would be about $1,000. I knew it wouldn't be cheaper than that. I thought, they're going to try and flog this thing for $1,000, and in the current market, they're going to be able to, so $1,000. And the tone of my review was what you saw at $1,000. So I thought it was a terrible, silly product at $1,000. And then it came out that it was $1,200. And I'm like, well, I can't be bothered changing the script. $1,000, $1,200, whatever, it's still not good value, and I don't really have too many nice things to say about this release. Even if it was relatively good value compared to the 3080, unless supply was going to be astronomical, it didn't do anyone a favor who couldn't buy a 3080. We know there's lots of people who had pre-orders that still didn't get them fulfilled. So, again, it comes back to why release these cards. Just fulfill the 3080 orders that people wanted, and continue to release AMP. Finish releasing AMP before you do what is technically considered to be the refresh. We got the super cards with Turing, and this is what you'd expect 12 months down the track if there's not something new to go.
Yeah, I think it was disappointing to see people, again, this is a small minority of commenters, a very small minority of commenters, going down the usual path of kind of, I don't know what the word is, maybe like simping for the companies, where they basically are just, looking at all the ways that this benefits Nvidia, talking about you're being unfair because obviously Nvidia is trying to make money, they're capitalizing on the market situation, and all those sorts of arguments. But at the end of the day, it's why are people getting into that argument? It doesn't benefit you as a consumer to go down that path of wanting the best for Nvidia's investors, unless you are, of course, an investor. But who cares whether Nvidia's executives get a huge bonus because they can ship a whole ton of more expensive graphics cards? I think you've seen across most reviews that reviewers are taking the side of consumers and these sorts of things. And when I talked in my announcement video about Nvidia, again, being tone deaf, sort of mocking and getting up in the face of gamers and saying, we've done the thing for gamers, but now you have to spend $1,200 on our next GPU. Getting annoyed at that is all about coming from the side of consumers, and there's no benefit to you at the end of the day with these products by sort of going about the mentality of thinking, we can justify this because Nvidia can now make a ton more money. It's like, well, no, really they should be selling 3080s. That is the better option for consumers at the end of the day, is to take the hit, the $500 hit for that silicon and make it a 3080 to fulfill the orders that they promised at the MSRP that they advertised back in September of last year. Of course, they don't want to do that. They want the $500. But again, we always want to see things go down a path that benefits consumers. Obviously, that wouldn't benefit Nvidia. That would benefit all of you guys massively if every 3080 Ti was a 3080 instead. But I always find that those sort of comments and things just a little bit frustrating, kind of the fanboy mentality that we've talked about many times on the channel before. It just doesn't make sense.
We see it. Yeah, that's right. We see it on all sides. We saw people defending the Core i9 11900K. We saw countless people defending the Ryzen 3000 XT series. We've seen it from all sides. But yeah, at the end of the day, we're doing this job for the viewers and not to justify, the bottom line at AMD, Nvidia, or Intel.
So I guess the final topic that I wanted to talk a little bit about, which is kind of joining these two things together, is that we've got the RTX 3070 Ti review coming up. It's launching next week, and obviously FSR is coming up pretty shortly as well. Do you think that the announcement of FSR is going to sort of change how you review, and not as much change how you review, but how you recommend NVIDIA GPUs, for example? You've talked a lot about DLSS being a really strong selling point of NVIDIA's products. Does the announcement of FSR, is that going to influence your reviews for these upcoming products?
I didn't really talk about DLSS too much for the 3080 Ti review, mostly because it's a 3090 in terms of DLSS performance. So there wasn't anything new to touch on there. I think probably the 3070 Ti will be quite similar. So it's probably something we can get away with not talking about too much. Obviously, the games that already have DLSS benefit from DLSS. So FSR doesn't change that in the least. But going forward, I guess it'll come down to what we see around, I think, June 22nd. And then what announcements we have for future games supporting it and stuff like that. And if it turns out that FSR is quite impressive and it is a competitive solution, then you wouldn't obviously weigh on DLSS so much because FSR works on Radeon GPUs and it works on GeForce GPUs. So it's difficult to say at this point in time, but obviously if it somewhat neutralizes DLSS, the advantage that NVIDIA has with DLSS, then you won't talk about DLSS as being a key selling point as we have for about a year or so now, since DLSS 2.0 started getting into a lot more games.
And I think for the short term as well, it's kind of a little situation where FSR is going to work on GeForce GPUs, so for at least some period of time, GeForce GPUs will have the benefit of FSR and DLSS, whereas on the AMD side, you'll only have FSR. So again, it's going to come down to game support, how we see the games list for FSR, improving over time. What happens to DLSS? Do we see a slowdown of adoption? And that balancing act, because I would expect at launch DLSS will be in maybe 50 games, and FSR might be in 5 or 10, but then in the future is that 100 DLSS games and 90 FSR games? That would change the argument quite a bit. But I think you had a final point here as well.
Well, obviously something we're going to have to constantly evaluate, and you'll be doing a lot of groundwork on that shortly, so that'll help me decide on how we should proceed. But as far as day one reviews go, it actually should make my job and other reviewers' job easier, because I think we would leave these upscaling technologies for featured content. And it'd be something we do separate from the reviews, because it's very difficult, and we've talked about this before, to just say, oh, look, DLSS offers 30% or 40% more performance. Because what does that mean? You need to do a performance analysis alongside a visual analysis. And doing all of that work is more work, really, than an entire graphics card review. So I think for the graphics card reviews, the fact that we now hopefully have an FSR, DLSS type competitor that is competitive, that will, as I said, neutralize the threat from DLSS, and we could basically largely ignore both of those technologies for a day one review and just look at native performance and compare how they perform in terms of native performance. Because if they're seeing, if Radeon GPUs and GeForce GPUs see similar image quality, say DLSS, and they both see about a 40% performance uplift, it scales pretty evenly, so there's no point doing all that additional benchmarking. So it'd be just a little feature in the reviews like it is now at most. It wouldn't be something where you're having to benchmark through all of the games using the native resolution, then do it all again with you'd end up with just a mess of graphs, and it probably wouldn't give you any additional information. But again, that is something that we will evaluate as we go forward.
Yeah, and I'm sure FSR will be very similar to DLSS in that in some games you're going to get a certain level of performance. In other games you get a different, maybe lower level of performance. As we've seen with DLSS, if you're already running at a really high level of performance in terms of frame rate, then DLSS isn't going to give you as much of a benefit as if you're running at like 4K 30 FPS, where you could see like double the performance. So again, like you say, that does really complicate the whole evaluating DLSS thing. And yeah, like I said, over time, I think the end goal with all these sorts of technologies is you get to an ecosystem where it's just another feature in games. You can choose to use it or choose not to use it. Like all those technologies that we've seen over the years, where occasionally things work a bit better on AMD, occasionally some things work a bit better on Nvidia. Years down the track, it all magically sorts itself out, and both do things pretty similarly. So yeah, it's going to be a pretty interesting sort of end of the year when it comes to assessing this sort of feature. And yeah, I think a couple of outlets have been maybe glossing over how massive of a feature this is and how that's going to really shake up a lot of these, I don't know, analysis that we're going to do throughout the rest of the year. It all really hinges on what AMD is able to achieve with the technology, but the fact that it's actually now here and available shortly for people to use is a bit earlier than I think a lot of us were expecting. And yeah, it's going to make for some interesting discussion points moving forward, especially for those that have older GPUs and don't have the means to upgrade them while the market continues to be pretty ridiculous. So yeah, lots to play out here, and I think both of us are very excited to see how it plays out, to do the testing, to figure out where it lies. And yeah, we just, as always, hope for things to be pretty competitive, because that makes things the most interesting.
Yep, I can't wait to watch all your hard work in your detailed analysis video.
Yep.
Because I can just sit back and enjoy it like everyone else. I didn't have to sit there doing all the benchmarking, compare image quality, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, Tim gets the honor of doing all of that. But you did a great job with DLSS, so yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, so I think that's probably all there is to it for this Computex sort of wrap-up thing, talking about two of the major things that were announced in this sort of Computex period. Yeah, I think there's probably a few more announcements for this Computex than I was expecting. I was sort of expecting to cruise through, get a few sort of basic announcements, and because it's not really an in-person show, it's kind of this live different thing where we're still here in Australia. Yeah, it's been very interesting to see companies still go pretty hard, especially on AMD's side, in terms of announcements at this time. So yeah, it's made it a bit more of an exciting week for news coverage than I was expecting, but that's always great. And yeah, we love to see things that increase competition, because that benefits consumers greatly at the end of the day. So yeah, if you enjoyed watching this video, then you can do all the usual stuff. Give it a like. You've just released a couple of BTS videos on our Patreon and Floatplane account, so if you're interested in seeing the progress on Steve's shed build, or well, his new studio build, I should say, as well as a bit of a gardening unboxed update, then we do have 2 new BTS videos available for our supporters, so it's well worth signing up. You get all the other benefits like our Discord community, our monthly live streams, which we'll probably be doing in a couple of weeks from now, and yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. Anything else to cover at the end of this discussion video that we always enjoy doing?
No, I think, good discussion. Time to wrap it up. So thank you everyone for watching. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim. We'll see you
next time.
in the next one.